Nightreign added a surprising amount of new lore to the Elden Ring setting and mythos. Understandably, lots of players might not be interested in playing a co-op roguelike, but they might be interested in some of the new lore that Nightreign has on offer. So this video is for you. But before I get into it, I do want to address whether or not Elden Ring Nightreign is even canon and where it falls into the timeline. Before Nightreign came out, the game's director, Junya Ishizaki, gave multiple interviews. Speaking with IGN, he said this: "We'd like fans to think of Nightreign as an Elden Ring spin-off, first and foremost. The story is completely separate and parallel to the world of Elden Rings. If you had to tie it in some way, we had the events of the Shattering in the original game. After the events of the Shattering, this is a completely separate branch of the Elden Ring story." And in a separate interview with Ungeek, Ishizaki said that the world of Elden Ring and Nightreign split around the time of the Shattering, so it exists in a separate timeline. "We had to strike a balance to ensure the mythos is similar up to a certain point, but also create a separate mythos for Nightreign." Nightreign has also been in development since winter of 2021, or before Elden Ring even came out. So it's quite possible that ideas that were cut from Elden Ring for whatever reason may have been repurposed for Nightreign, including any potential lore. Case in point, in the 1.0 version of Elden Ring, Limgrave was also known as the Domain of Tenebrae, which is Latin for darkness, and that takes on a whole new meaning with Nightreign. So to reiterate, Nightreign takes place in a parallel world, but the timeline split only after Marika shattered the Elden Ring. Since that happened relatively late in the timeline, both games still share a lot of the same backstory and lore. However, in Nightreign itself, the opening cinematic instead mentions the Shattering War, as opposed to the shattering of the Elden Ring itself. So this would put the point of divergence a bit later than what we're told in the interviews. How much later is unclear. We do know that after Marika shattered the Elden Ring, there was a sovereign alliance between the demigods, as shown by a sword monument and by the intro cinematic to Morgoth's boss fight. But again, we don't know how long this alliance lasted. The timeline split also lets us see the story cinematic in a whole new light.
The shattering ensued, a war that wrought only darkness.
There also don't seem to be too many points of divergence between the main Elden Ring timeline and what happens in Nightreign. Grace still exists in Limveld, as seen by the sites of Grace and the handful of plants nourished by Grace. But the guidance of Grace, which had been bestowed by Marika and is a separate entity, no longer exists in Nightreign. The Wending Grace is an afterglow of lost grace unleashed by the tide of night. The world crumbles, and yet light, forgetful of its own path, still seeks a follower to bestow guidance upon, summoning again grace once lost. So this item further emphasizes the distinction between grace and the guidance of grace. As for when Nightreign takes place, it seems to happen in a distant future. The Slate Whetstone tells us that the clash with night has spanned eons, and yet now, precious little time remains. We also learn from Executor's remembrance that the Erd Tree no longer exists.
"I heard that in the lands between, there was once a thing of wonder known as the Erd Tree. I must say, where we are headed, there shall be no such tree. But if we can repulse the night, it may yet be restored."
As for what exactly happened to the Erd Tree, I have an entire video on that topic. Finally, I will point out that Nightreign might actually have a canon explanation for any potential retcons. We learn that the Trace of Night contains the qualities of the Night Lord, bearing the manifest potential to alter fate itself. And I think we see this type of power in the main ending of the game. I agree with a lot of people that in the main ending, we effectively retcon the game and prevent the night from ever wreaking havoc on the lands between. Since we can once again see the Erd Tree, the Nightfarers essentially retcon themselves out of existence. So that effectively closes the loop on the Nightreign timeline, which I think is very elegant and a very clever way of dealing with any potential discrepancies. Also known as Augur, Maris is an unknown entity that drifts through the skies. It makes an ocean of its surroundings, that it may blend with wherever life is found. as if in a dream. And I believe that Meris is a bridge between Meter and the Elden Beast. All three bosses have aquatic arenas and come across as primordial, ethereal entities. Personally, I think Meris is the oldest of the three since it doesn't have hands. Next up would be Meter, since she has fingers but no thumbs, and the Elden Beast would be the youngest and the most evolutionarily advanced, since the Elden Beast has thumbs as well as toes, because of course it does. Meris's design seems more similar to the Elden Beast, since it looks like a man of war, a water flea, or...
It's a big, stupid jellyfish.
Well, bang, okay?
That said, I think Meris is more closely connected with Meter. Both Meter and Meris spawn ads throughout their fights. The two also seem to have just one eye, and both Meter and Meris may be either depressed or have low int, since Meter stares vacantly, while Meris has lived an aimless life of floating. I also want to point out that Augur's full name is a fantastic play on words. Meris most likely comes from Stella Maris, which is Latin for Star of the Sea. This is a devotional title given to the Virgin Mary. It fits Meris quite well, given the aquatic theme for this boss fight. And since Meris is spawning absolutely fatherless ads, Meris could even be seen as a virgin mother, and so could Meter now that I think about it. In addition, a fathom is used to measure how deep water is, while to fathom something means to understand it. Now, I do love this localization choice. The only downside is that it misses a potentially strong connection between Meris and previous FromSoft games. In the Japanese, the title Fathom of Night is more literally translated as the deep sea of the night, and that kanji was also translated as the deep sea, both in Dark Souls 3 and in Bloodborne. In the Soul of Aldrich, we learn that when Aldrich ruminated on the fading of the fire, it inspired visions of a coming age of the deep sea. He knew the path would be arduous, but he had no fear. He would devour the gods himself. Likewise, the Aldrich Faithful Covenant item is the holy symbol of the Cathedral of the Deep, and crest of those who see beyond fire to the age of deep waters. Elsewhere in DS3, we learn that the deep was originally a peaceful and sacred place, but became the final rest for many abhorrent things. And the great deep soul is the glorious bedrock of this world. It's my own personal headcanon that Meris and the deep sea is effectively a minor retcon for the vision that Aldrich once saw. For more information about the deep, I highly recommend this video by Ratatosker. As for Bloodborne, the kanji for deep sea appears in the deep sea Carol runes, and I can't resist quoting this line from their description. Great volumes of water serve as a bulwark, guarding sleep, and an augur of the eldritch truth. Speaking of augurs, I believe that in Nightreign, Meris is connected to the Claymen and the Oracle Envoys. For starters, an augur can be another name for an oracle. The Oracle Bubble is a sorcery of the Claymen who served as priests in the ancient dynasty. The Claymen search for lost oracles within their bubbles. In addition, the Claymen Ashes are the warped remains of priests who searched for revelation in service of the ancient dynasty. We're never told what this ancient dynasty is exactly, but it's most likely a reference to this figure, aka Elden John. If you get invaded by Augur, the boss is also called the Master of Bubbles, and both the Claymen and Oracle Envoys have weaponized bubbles. Over on Reddit, Na McGrath made a great comparison between the Oracle Bubbles of the Claymen and the microcosms that conveyed signals to Meter. That description also tells us that the broken and discarded are fully willing to cling to fleeting simulacra, earning them some modicum of sympathy. This of course applies to Meter, who once received signs from the greater will from the beyond of the microcosms. Despite being broken and abandoned, she kept waiting for another message to come. But being broken and discarded could also apply to Meris. In its relic, we learn that for the first time in its existence, the drifting ancient being realized its interest had been piqued. Indeed, it had been roused from its ancient life to floating, camouflaged within its surroundings. The strange taste of this night was all too lonely, and more vast than it could ever know. So I wonder if the Claymen were trying to communicate with Meris, but Meris was completely uninterested in them. Of course, there is the Lovecraftian concept of an idiot god. Or it could just be Maris just wanted to leave the claimant on red. Who knows? The claimant do have quite a few connection to the game's more cosmic elements. We find the claimant underground near the eternal cities of Nokron and Nokstella, and the sigil for the claimant bubbles is identical to the sigil for the Celian Night sorceries, which were created by the descendants of the Nox. The claimant even used meteorites to make their harpoons, and in the 1.0 version, the Oracle Bubble spell was instead called a Lost Ancient Glintstone sorcery. During Ironeye's remembrance, we learn that he is actually one of those who live in death. This group emerged after coming into contact with Deathroot, which spread throughout the lands between, following the assassination of Godwyn the Golden. By the time Elden Ring started, those who live in death are the main targets of persecution by Marika's Golden Order.
Those who live in death fall outside the principles of the Golden Order. Their mere existence sullies the guidance of gold, tainting its truth. And so it is the vermin must be exterminated, down to the very last.
Those who live in death are so shunned they can't even find sanctuary at Miquella's Haligtree, which otherwise acts as a safe haven for many of those deemed impure by the Golden Order, like the Albanoirics, the Kindred of Rot, and the Misbegotten. But there are those who want to help those who live in death.
The very notion of life in death defies the Golden Order. By Dee's account, these defiled fiends must be expunged. But truth be told, I seek the curse mark to save them. You may find this peculiar, but I discovered something in my examination of the Knight of the Black Knives. These souls have committed no offense. They have every right to life, only they happen to touch upon a flaw in the Order.
And it was the persecution of those who live in death that caused Goldmask to begin to question the Golden Order, as we learn from the spell Order Healing. So clearly, the game presents the persecution of those who live in death as a negative. But with all of that being said, from a mechanical perspective, those who live in death are basically just another undead trash mob for us to kill. But in Nightreign, the revelation that Ironeye is one of those who live in death means that they are sapient and makes their persecution much more relatable and tragic. We also learn in a letter from Isolde to Ironeye that the scions of the Fellowship are fated to be disposed of once they play their part. Thus, I had a dream, to wrest the power of the night and bend the rules which govern our realm. The scions raised would wander through an endless night, fighting on and on, a night that would never break. This endless night also reminded me of what Gideon says,
Queen Marika has high hopes for us, that we continue to struggle. Unto eternity.
It's also implied that Ioneye's fellowship may have been an offshoot of both the Volcano Manor and Fia. Fia calls herself one of those who live in death. I also want to point out that the Fia ending is called the Age of the Duskborn, which could be seen as a prelude to an endless night. Much like Rykard's recusants, the Fellowship uses sealed envelopes that outline targets for assassination, a practice, we're told, that started in the lands between. We also know that the Volcano Manor is opposed to the Erd Tree.
Why not join the Volcano Manor and fight with us, rise with us, against the Erd Tree?
And by prolonging the night, Ironeye and Isolde would prevent the Erd Tree from re-emerging. In addition, we also know that Fia's bath spray was developed to oppose the Roundtable Hold and is effective only against the Tarnished. And like Ranni, Fia is also an assassin since she killed Dee at the Roundtable Hold.
I love the kind of woman that will actually just kill me.
The Roundtable Hold returns in Nightreign, and it once again acts as the hub. This is actually my second favorite hub in a FromSoft game. Now, the Roundtable Hold we visit in Nightreign is the fourth version we've come across. In Elden Ring, there's the Roundtable Hold we normally visit, the OG version we can find in Leyndell, and a third, shadowy version that only appears when you get invaded by Ensha. But unlike its main counterpart in Elden Ring, which is located outside of this world, the Roundtable Hold in Nightreign is physically connected to the rest of the world. After all, every expedition starts with you taking a hawk to a piece of Lemveld. In an interview found in the Elden Ring art books, Hidetaka Miyazaki hinted at deeper lore behind the Roundtable Hold. This is, in a way, a place far removed from the world, though it's modeled after the fortified manor in Leyndell, with its state and power originating from the Erd Tree. This is why when the Erd Tree burns, the Roundtable burns as well. As for the reason behind the Roundtable Hold's existence, while there is lore that answers this question, it's something we decided not to touch upon in this game, so I won't be revealing it here either. However, it's safe to say that the Two Fingers plays a key role. But in Nightreign, it looks like we finally got the reason behind the Roundtable Hold's existence. Each hold seems to have been built with a purpose in mind. In Nightreign, we learn that the Cutting Gifted tribe built the Roundtable Hold specifically to combat the night. Fill the Lord and thy sins absolve. Upon the breaking of the night, the hold shall crumble, and thou too shalt be unbound. And in Elden Ring, Gideon tells us,
You burned the Erd Tree, didn't you? Then the Round Table is soon to follow. No need to fret about that. The Round Table Hold served to put a tarnish, and if the Erd Tree needed to burn for that to happen, then the Round Table must go as well.
But Gideon ultimately became disillusioned with the Two Fingers.
Take no heed of cardinal sin. The Two Fingers lost their purpose a long, long time ago.
In addition, each Roundtable Hold needs a specific prisoner to exist. In Nightreign, this role is performed by the Duchess. During Wilder's Remembrance, we learn that the Priestess is the very cornerstone of the Round Table, indispensable. Should the Night Lord fall, the Round Table too will crumble, as their fates are together bound. Yet should the Round Table be remade, the Priestess may be emancipated from her bindings. This might be done upon the falling of the new night, should the Lord's power be lost. And we have these dialogue lines as well.
When the Round Table's purpose is served, each sin is absolved, and everyone is sent back. The Round Table itself will become unmoored from the outside world. I suspect nothing of this place will remain, unless the impossible should occur. My lady, I shall accompany you till the very end.
The Round Table Hold and I are one and the same. I am rooted to this place. My exit forbidden.
And in Elden Ring, I believe this prisoner role is fulfilled by Hugh.
I see you've noticed the chains. Nothing special. I'm a prisoner and these are my chains. I'm trapped by the hold. I'm dying, smithing for you fools. That's all there is to it.
There's also the fact that Hugh loses his memories, and in Nightreign, the Nightfarers are suffering from amnesia. In fact, the Iron Menial even says it's a miracle that Wilder is able to recover some of his memories. Finally, before Nightreign came out, we got a surprisingly deep piece of lore about the Roundtable Hold in a random tweet. Tucked away in a hidden crevice of time, the Roundtable Hold awaits your arrival, a lone flicker of hope, standing as a brilliant light against the encroaching night. The phrase hidden crevice of time reminded me of how Placidusax's arena is described as beyond time. In the Japanese, the kanji for beyond time could also be translated as in the time between, and it was used in the phrase the lands between. Entering Placidusax's arena and the Roundtable Hold are the only places where you can reset the past. In Elden Ring, you can only enter New Game Plus at the Roundtable Hold. And in Nightreign, after finishing the game, you get a pop-up message saying this: return to the Roundtable Hold to a time when the primordial Night Lord was not yet defeated. I'll also point out, after you defeat Hylster, the Roundtable Hold appears in the arena, but it looks much more dilapidated, as if eons of time have passed. This reminded me quite a bit of the flash forward at the end of the Ring City DLC in Dark Souls 3. And this further connects the idea that the Roundtable Hold has the power to manipulate time. Obviously, there's a gameplay mechanical reason for this, but I do think it is consistent with a lot of the lore that has been established. In addition to being the cornerstone of the Roundtable Hold, the Duchess has another key role in Nightreign. She conveys a message from her Formless master.
I am the priestess, the voice of your Formless master. This message is for you. You will hear it often. Seekers of redemption. On the third night, this land will fall. Band together and prepare to claim the life of the Night Lord. That is all.
Now, we're never told exactly who this Formless Master is, but I think it might be the Greater Will. For starters, when the Duchess relays this message, it reminded me of how Enya interprets the words of the two fingers. We're also told in the opening cinematic that order is shattered, and since the Greater Will is so heavily associated with order, it would make sense that it would seek to restore order. Now, if you played Shadow of the Erdtree, this might be a surprise. In the DLC, we learn about Metter, the magnificently gleaming daughter of the Greater Will. Metter once received signs from the Greater Will from the beyond of the Microcosm. Despite being broken and abandoned, she kept waiting for another message to come. In other words, Metter had been in contact with the Greater Will, but something caused Metter to lose touch. As for what it was, I have a video about that very topic. This revelation was actually hinted at in the base game. When you defeat Morgott and see that Radagon has sealed off the Erdtree, you can return to Enya and see that the two fingers have gone silent.
The fingers remain still, shaken by this turn of events. They are busy consulting the Greater Will. When they are finished, the fingers will again offer their guidance. But thousands, if not tens of thousands, of moons must first pass. No matter for me, but you. How will you ever manage to wait?
As I mentioned before, in Nightreign, the clash with the night has spanned eons, so it's possible that Nightreign takes place after the Roundtable Hold has re-established contact with the Greater Will. And once again, Nightreign is a divergent timeline. In short, Nightreign is the good ending, where the Greater Will comes back with the jug of milk. There's also this line from Duchess's speech.
Seekers of redemption.
Redemption made me think of Count Emir, who is one of the few people in the lands between who knows the truth about the fingers and the Greater Will.
Is there no hope for redemption? The answer, sadly, is clear. There never was any hope. They were each of them defective, unhinged from the start. Marika herself, and the fingers that guided her. And this is what troubles me. No matter our efforts, if the roots are rotten, then we have little recourse.
And there's this line from his finger robe, I will be the true mother, my fingers will grant us redemption. Now, if the Formless Master is another name for the Greater Will, I do have mixed feelings. On the one finger, that could undermine the cosmic horror elements and existential dread of being abandoned by a power beyond our comprehension. But on the other finger, it is very funny to think that the lands between lost contact with God because some jagoff smashed up their Wi-Fi router. That is the true prepare to cry. That said, in Elden Ring, there may actually be precedent for reconnecting with the Greater Will. If you do Goldmask's quest, you can find the Mending Rune of Perfect Order. Unlike the Mending Runes for Fia and
the loathsome Dung Eater,
Goldmask discovered his. It's possible Goldmask was able to make contact with the Greater Will, which in turn either sent him the Mending Rune or gave him the coordinates for the Mending Rune to discover. But that is just one explanation, and I will be discussing it further in an upcoming lore biography about this ever-brilliant scholar. It's also fascinating that the Sacred Relic Sword still exists in Nightreign, and it has the same item description in both games. So, on its face, this means that Radagon must have been defeated by the time of Nightreign. The easier option would have been for FromSoft to just not include the lore item description. They could have just left the codex entry blank, and in fact, FromSoft actually added a minor piece of lore to this sword. In Nightreign, the sword has a new unique power called the Power of the Greater Will. With all of that said, I do want to address this tweet from the official Elden Ring account. It says, "All world will be undone, ravaged by living abominations." unless you stand together against their formless master. Obviously, this is a piece of promotional material and not exactly canon. But if we take it on its face, this tweet implies that the living abominations, the Night Lords, are doing the bidding of a formless master, which is completely at odds with the Duchess. So if the formless master is the greater will, it could be playing both sides. Or Kjolster and the Night Lords misinterpret the will of the formless master.
Giants.
One of the biggest mysteries in Elden Ring are the giant heads you can find across the lands between. But Shadow of the Erdtree gave us a major clue. In the DLC, you can find the ancient meteoric ore greatsword, which was fashioned from an excavated shard of an arrowhead that was once a part of the old god's arsenal. Since that colossal sword was actually just a piece of an arrowhead, it must have been fired by an absolute unit. And in Nightreign, during the second day, you can see these giants slowly form and marching in the background. Then in the ending cutscene, we see a massive giant wear armor with fingerprints all over it. This reminded me of the knight set you can find in the DLC. According to its description, flowing lines in the seeming shape of a fingerprint adorn the surface, imprisons the wearer in utterly lightless dark, bestowed upon those born deep underground, ordaining them as sword hands of night. I'll also point out that the Recluse can make a cocktail that deals white lightning, which looks very similar to the Ash of War from the ancient meteoric or greatsword. This light also reminded me of the Rain of Light called down by the Miranda flowers, which is an aspect of the Crucible. And the giants, of all sizes, are deeply linked with the Crucible. As we find out in the DLC, the mother of crucibles was rumored to have sprouted upon giants in ancient tower lore. In the 1.0 version of Elden Ring, the spell Founding Rain of Stars, which is the founding glintstone sorcery, was instead called Goliath's Rain of Stars, and that takes on a whole new meaning with Nightreign. It's not outright stated, but I believe that Caligo is one of the ice dragons that ruled the mountaintops of the giants before they were defeated by the fire giants, as told in the spell Borealis' Mist. Let's talk about the goat in Nightreign. Libra is a goat-headed being who pretends to be a man, said to be able to use a dubious form of alchemy. Counterfeit gold causes loss of sanity, beckoning madness. There's quite a bit to unpack here. For starters, the fact that Libra deals with counterfeit gold could explain how the nomadic merchants were infected with madness. They made deals with Libra. As a nomadic tribe that trades all across the lands between, the merchants would be an ideal vector for spreading the flame of frenzy. According to one of the drippiest sets in the game, the nomadic set, the merchants once thrived as the Great Caravan, but after being accused of heretical beliefs, their entire clan was rounded up and buried alive far underground. Then they chanted a curse of despair and summoned the flame of frenzy. However, the nomad ashes tell us that the tribe of merchants was entombed in the earth so as to bury the maddening disease that followed them. At first, this might seem like a contradiction, but there is an elegant solution. The merchants had been infected with the flame of frenzy before they were rounded up. It's also possible they weren't followers of the Three Fingers before their persecution, but then converted after the fact. A self-fulfilling prophecy, in a sense. It's also interesting that in Nightreign, the merchants are only spirits. It's possible they were all eventually killed by the bell-bearing hunter. And that's my own personal headcanon for why he is absolutely OP in the game. He's been buffing himself with all of the goods he was able to buy through the bell bearings. Libra's relics are easily the two worst relics in Nightreign, but there is some interesting lore from them. When you fight Libra, he enters a meditative pose, and if you equip his relic and meditate, that is, use the crossed legs gesture, you can become mad and then restore FP. So it is fascinating that entering a state of meditation leads to frenzy, and this type of connection was already hinted at in Shadow of the Erdtree. According to the hefty frenzied flame pot, the flame of frenzy burns the eyes, but tranquility follows in its wake. May this pot bring salvation to those it strikes. It's also worth mentioning that the Eye of Yellow, which is heavily associated with the flame of frenzy, can also be used for its pain-relieving properties. Libra also makes explicit a connection between the Frenzied Flame and the Golden Order. In Shadow of the Erd Tree, the Golden Crux Ash of War for Midra says that there is something of the Golden Order in the sight of those fixed upon this crux. Maybe it's just me, but when Libra transitions to his new phase in his Everdark version, he makes a gesture that looks a lot like the Light of Mikola, which the young Empyrean unlocked after his apotheosis at the Divine Gateway. So I think Libra and his counterfeit gold may represent a false path of enlightenment. As for where Libra came from, I have two fun theories. In Shadow of the Erd Tree, you can come across sheep in the abyssal woods that have been touched by the Flame of Frenzy. We also see that Libra has hands and wields a staff with a hand on top of it. And according to the Cinque Dea, having 5 fingers is symbolic of the intelligence that was once granted upon the beast folk. In the 1.0 version, this intelligence was directly bestowed by the Greater Will, and as it happens, the Abyssal Woods is not too far away from the Cathedral of Manus Meter, which houses a magnificently gleaming daughter of the Greater Will. So I like to think that Libra was once an ordinary goat who got touched by the Flame of Frenzy, and then he was able to have intelligence bestowed upon him, much like the beast folk. As an alternate explanation, it's possible that Libra was once a Capra demon that followed the Centipede demon and the Gaping Jaw into Limveld before he got frenzied. The Divine Towers are one of the game's bigger mysteries, and it turns out they might actually be trees. In Nightreign, over the course of 2 nights, you see a tree slowly form and then encircle a tower. I think it's fascinating that the Divine Towers might actually be grown and not necessarily built. It's also possible they were once part of the Great Tree root system. A common motif throughout Elden Ring is the notion of people becoming trees. Mikola embedded himself inside the Halig tree, while in the Shaman village we can see the grandmother inside a tree. And in Nightreign, if you do Raider's Remembrance, it ends with a climactic battle against his rival, Whitehorn. And during this fight, we see him turn into an ulcerated tree spirit. This transformation actually gives us a surprising amount of lore. The ulcerated tree spirits are found throughout catacombs and can drop golden seeds. Golden seeds only emerged after the Elden Ring was shattered, scattering across the various lands as if life itself knew its end had come. This reminded me of the origin of the Erd Tree avatars. According to the Erd Tree staff, the avatars started emerging in the wake of the Elden Ring shattering, and were determined to protect the withering Erd Tree's offspring. The offspring are the minor Erd Trees found throughout the lands between. But the Erd Tree avatars aren't the only defenders of the minor Erd Trees. Sprinkled throughout the lands between are the Tree Guardians. These Guardians wear armor that comes in 2 varieties. According to the basic Guardian garb, in accordance with an ancient pact with the Erd Tree, it is said that their deaths led not to destruction, but instead to renewed eternal life as Guardians. Meanwhile, according to the full bloom version of the Guardian garb, which can only be obtained inside Leyndell, it is said that the blood-red flowers blooming on their backs mark the senescence of their ancient pact. Perhaps the Guardians are part tree already. Since the Tree Guardians can become trees and are often found near Erd Tree avatars, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to assume that some of the Tree Guardians would ultimately become Erd Tree avatars. As a corollary, I think the Worm Faces are Tree Guardians who became corrupted by Deathblight. The Worm Faces can sometimes drop sacrificial twigs, which are believed to be a twig pruned from the Erd Tree long ago. And these items are incredibly precious. Only a select few people have access to them. So the fact that the Worm Faces have access to such a valuable item does suggest that they were once more closely aligned with the Erd Tree. It's also worth mentioning that the Twiggy Crack tier, which has a similar effect to the sacrificial twigs, shows up at a minor Erd Tree surrounded by Deathblight, which also happens to be right above Godwyn. There's also the fact that the ulcerated tree spirits, the Erd Tree avatars, and the Worm Faces can all bleed, which to me suggests that they were all once people. Nightreign further blurs the line between living beings and inanimate objects. For starters, the Roundtable Hold is maintained by the Iron Menial, who has his own personality. the Iron Menial is clearly a marionette soldier from Rea Lucaria who was repurposed. Now in Elden Ring, the marionette soldiers drop runes when defeated, and can be summoned as spirit ashes. I used to think that was just a gameplay concession, but Nightreign makes clear that inanimate objects can be alive, and the Iron Menial even has a religious or spiritual side as well. And if you finish Executor's Remembrance, his cursed blade actually changes its name to Suncatcher. The Iron Menial explains,
"The blade you wear upon your hip is not the same as it once was. Not in outward appearance, but in its very being. I wonder why I feel so strongly this must be true. Perhaps it is because I too reside in a frame inanimate."
In fact, during Wilder's Remembrance, you can come across a silver tear, which in Nightreign is a kernel of life that straddles the living and inanimate. I'll also point out, in the DLC we can find the smithing talisman, which tells us, in ancient times, smithing was a divine act, and blacksmiths interpreted the script they perceived and the wrinkles of molten steel to imbue weapons with souls. On a related note, during Revenant's Remembrance, we learn that everyone's favorite gremlin was crafted by the prestigious House of Northerncroft, a family of master puppeteers. She never was a human, and now the mantle of doll no longer fits her. Personally, I think this family made the puppets that were used to house the souls for Ranni and Selen. Celavis seems to specialize into turning people into puppets as opposed to creating dolls that can house a soul. Ranni gives us the spirit calling bell, while her mom is one of the few bosses who can summon. And of course, the Revenant is the only Nightfarer who can summon spirits. There also seems to be some type of connection between the Revenant and Radagon, Renala's husband. When we first encounter the Revenant, she's staring at a portrait of Radagon, and when you fight her as a boss, she casts triple rings of light, a Golden Order fundamentalist incantation that was a gift from the young Mikola to his father Radagon. It's also possible that we might have found Ranni's missing rune, as Gideon tells us.
Ranni is said to have cast aside her great rune.
After we saw what Mikola did to his great rune in Shadow of the Erd Tree, Ranni's is the only one left unaccounted for. And in Nightreign, he also drops the Primordial Night Lord's rune, which has the properties of a great rune. So I wonder if that was once the great rune that Ranni discarded, but over time it became corrupted by the influence of the night. That said, I still like the theory that Ranni's rune is up on the moon. A lot of people in the community have pointed out that you can see a shape on the moon that looks a lot like a great rune, but I think this might be a compelling alternative. Throughout the Executor's Remembrance, we literally catch a glimpse of what life was like as a Crucible Knight. And I also think the painter in his remembrance is the wandering artist mentioned in the paintings you can find throughout the Lands Between and the Land of Shadow. According to their descriptions, this painter is said to have captured the landscapes seen during the last moments of those welcomed into death's embrace. The soul of the painter and vestiges of the dead's last moments can be discovered by visiting the location depicted even now, and I believe this is also captured in the Executor's painting of the Erd Tree. During his remembrance, after you defeat yourself, the Executor becomes a spirit and sees a dead Crucible Knight, a dead woman, and a Crucible Knight who commits seppuku. This sequence is left deliberately ambiguous, but personally I think the Executor is suffering from dissociative identity disorder and is in fact all of these figures we see. In addition, the wandering artist being a Crucible Knight could explain how he was able to get access to so many areas throughout the Lands Between and the Land of Shadow, and how he was able to survive being in these incredibly dangerous environments. One of the most iconic Nightfarers is the Guardian, the lone surviving member of his people, the Pinionfolk.
I once read a story about a realm far west of the Lands Between where fighting erupted. One side was comprised of winged men.
But who are the Pinionfolk exactly? I think the Stormhawk King mated with a human and gave birth to the Pinionfolk. This reminded me of the man-serpent ashes. It is said that long ago, the elder serpent that dwelled on Mount Gelmir devoured a demigod, and the birth of the man-serpents followed. And the Datakar's Woe Talisman is named after a woman who indulged in every form of adultery and wicked pleasure imaginable, giving birth to a myriad of grotesque children. That does raise the critical question, who banged the Stormhawk King? I think it was most likely an ancestor of Nefeli Lu. If you give her the Stormhawk King, she says this.
Is that ash? I can smell the ancient storm in it. My thanks. I'll gladly take it. This ash, it reminds me of my first hawk.
So clearly there was some type of connection between the two. Nefeli is also aghast at what Godric has done to Stormveil.
How utterly repellent this is. This grafting of Godric's ill befits a lord. He's tainted the very winds.
In Elden Ring, hawks are deeply related to Stormveil. And then there's the fact that Hoarah, aka Godfrey, faced the Storm Lord alone. Before Shadow of the Erdtree, I was 50-50 on the Storm Lord being either the Stormhawk King or Placidusax, since the latter does dwell in a storm beyond time. But when the DLC came out, we learned that Placidusax was defeated and grievously wounded by
Bale! Vile Bale!
And with the addition of the Pinionfolk, I think it's much more likely that the Storm Lord is in fact the Stormhawk King. I'll also point out, wings are an aspect of the Crucible, and in Shadow of the Erdtree, the Divine Bird Warriors were said to bear resemblance to the Golden Crucible. So the Pinionfolk could represent in a way the reconciliation between the Stormhawks of Stormveil and Hoarah and the Golden Order. This reminded me of how Godwyn was able to reconcile with the ancient dragons after they attacked Leyndell. And yes, I do believe that Godwyn and Fortisax did in fact. During Guardian's Remembrance, we also learned that the Recluse used a weapon called the Ictaurus to rob the Pinionfolk of their wings, and the Ictaurus leaves a wound that can never heal, owing to an ancient curse with the power to twist life. And if you get defeated by Morgott or one of the Night Lord invasions, you get the debuff Unhealed Wound. It's also telling that the Ictaurus leaves a permanent scar. I immediately thought of two scarred bodies in Elden Ring. There's the Curse Mark of Death, which left a permanent scar on Ranni's body. And there's also the Elden Beast, the living incarnation of the concept of order, which has a scar. This does raise the possibility that the Recluse might have been working with the Nox, or is at the very least Nox adjacent. In addition, I think the Recluse was part of the same coven as Ranni's mentor. We know that the Recluse comes from the deep woods, and in Elden Ring, Ranni met the snowy crone deep in the woods, who was most likely Renna. The Recluse also has a similar diction and manner of speaking to Ranni. The Recluse is well known for having a massive hat. According to the Snow Witch hat, the pointed hat is associated with practitioners of heretical sorcery. What's more, Recluse's ultimate is the Soul Blood Song, which unleashes a forbidden blood chant. We can also unlock an outfit for the Recluse without a pointy hat, and I'm assuming this is from a time before she turned to heretical sorcery. In Nightreign, we come across what might be a third eternal city of the Nox, Noklateo. This is actually my favorite Shifting Earth event. Scum Mage Infer already made a very thorough video about this third eternal city, and he makes a very compelling case that Noklateo was once part of Leyndell. However, as Tarnished Archaeologist pointed out, in the story trailer, we see an army marching on to the gate of Leyndell. But in the game, that gate doesn't lead to anywhere, it opens up to a giant void. And before Nightreign came out, Tarnished Archaeologist also made a very compelling case that the Nameless Eternal City was the lower part of Leyndell. Personally, I think this could be a point of divergence. Nightreign diverges from Elden Ring only during the Shattering War. In the main timeline, the Eternal City collapsed underneath Leyndell, but in Nightreign, Noklateo was instead sealed underground before it ultimately re-emerged in Limveld. This would place the literal fall of Noklateo much later in the timeline. Just to clarify, I believe that the fall of Noklateo is a different event from what the Nox did to provoke the ire of the Greater Will that got them cancelled. So this would imply that Noklateo only disappeared after the Night of the Black Knives. In Nightreign, you can duplicate a weapon in Noklateo and in the Wandering Mausoleum. And in Elden Ring, the Wandering Mausoleums house the remains of nameless demigods, who were also killed on the Night of the Black Knives. This was even clearer in the 1.0 version of Nightreign, which had a very different description for Noklateo. The city was said to shelter a nameless demigod, who had the power to replicate even that which has no double in this world. Many thanks to Sekiro Doobie for pointing that out. I also think Noklateo may have been the name for Leyndell before Marika took over. After all, Leyndell is clearly inspired by the Byzantine Empire, which had its capital city changed from Byzantium to Constantinople, and was later changed to Istanbul when it fell to the Ottomans. The Outer Gods are some of the most mysterious aspects of the mythos in Elden Ring. In the game, there are only 4 gods that are described as Outer Gods: the Outer God of Rot, the Formless Mother, the Flame of Frenzy, and the Outer God of the Deathbirds. In Nightreign, one of these shifting earth events involves the Rotted Woods, which has been transformed by the power of an Outer God, the Outer God of Rot. But in Elden Ring, this Outer God was sealed away by the Blue Dancer, who was also Malenia's mentor. So the Outer God of Rot has either broken containment, or it has found a new vessel. Nightreign may have added an entirely new Outer God. This Outer God is only mentioned in the bone-like stone, which you find during Recluse's remembrance. This is both a disturbing stone with a distinct lifelessness, and the bone of an Outer God, with the power to expunge divine essence, but that can also be destroyed by the same essence. The Iron Menial also says this after he gives it to the Recluse.
I sense a great power within. Power enough to change a person's fate, I do believe.
And since fate is deeply interlinked with the stores in Elden Ring, this Outer God must be both incredibly powerful and some type of cosmic entity. I also think this Outer God is alluded to in the Trace of Night. This contains the qualities of the Night Lord, bearing the manifest potential to alter fate itself. The light dimly reveals the contours of a greater being that lies beyond the Night Lord. So who could this Outer God possibly be? Instead of it being a completely new entity, I think this Outer God of Night is actually another name for the Primeval Current. Here's a quick recap. The Primeval Current is a forbidden tradition of glintstone sorcery, and it's not hard to see why. Its most infamous practitioner was also the game's best waifu.
She was known as the Graven Witch. Obsessed by the primeval current, countless sorcerers fell to her hand. The most dangerous mage in the entire history of Rhea Lucaria's academy.
If you recall, I was exiled from the Academy of Rhea Lucaria. It was for attempting to restore the primeval current of glintstone sorcery. The toothless pedantry peddled by the Carian royal family can rot for all I care. I want glintstone sorceries that open our minds, unbound by terrestrial taboos.
Now, let's get back to Nightreign. If the Outer God of Night is the Primeval Current, this may explain Hjolster's signature move. In his second phase, he can fly up and tear open a rift in the night sky. When this happens, I believe Hjolster is actually channeling the power of the Primeval Current. This is akin to how Mohg pierces the body of another Outer God, the Formless Mother, to harness her power. The game's title reminded me of the spell Founding Rain of Stars, which releases a violent deluge of star rain. According to its description, this spell is thought to be the founding glintstone sorcery. The glimpse of the primeval current that the astrologer saw became real, and the star's amber rained down on this land. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see a connection between the Founding Rain of Stars and the Night Rain in Limveld. We get another clue from the Knight of the Baron relic, which you get after defeating Adele. Adele was once an apex predator, but was left with a ravening, unending hunger when the sky began to weep in hues of azure. The color azure immediately made me think of
Azure,
who was once Selen's mentor and a sorcerer who saw the primeval current. He also gives you his comet, which fires a tremendous comet in a torrent akin to the distant starry expanse, the place said to be the origin of glintstone. However, in the Japanese, the rain is described with the same color as the starlight shard, so in both versions, the night rain is connected to the stars. Another clue tying the primeval current to the outer god of night comes from the dual nature of the bone-like stone. It's both inorganic, it's a stone, and organic, it's a bone. The stone's dual nature is a parallel to the primeval sorcerers Azure and Lusat. Both men caught glimpses of the primeval current, but by the end of their lifetimes, their minds had been replaced with glintstone, and they reached a near-inorganic state. There's also the Crystallians, near-inorganic beings, yet they live. And similar to Azure and Lusat, the Crystallians cleave closely to the ideals of the primeval current. In addition, the primeval current can take many different forms depending on the observer. In the game, there were only 3 primeval sorceries, and yet all of them describe the primeval current differently. I already mentioned how in the Founding Rain of Stars spell, an ancient astrologer saw the stars amber rain down on this land. But when Lusat glimpsed into the primeval current, he beheld the final moments of a great star cluster, and upon seeing it, he too was broken. And finally, when Azure glimpsed into the primeval current, he saw darkness. He was left both bewitched and fearful of the abyss. In other words, I believe the primeval current is ever-changing, which fits its name rather well. If that's the case, that could also explain why Heolster is able to change between different status effects and elemental damage types after he tears open a rift in the night sky. Finally, as tons of people have pointed out, it looks like there's a giant eye in the sky watching us in the Night Lord's arena. Nameless Singer has a great video explaining why that eye most likely belongs to the outer god of night. But what's less known is that during the first 2 days in Limveld, an eye also forms in the sky over the tower tree. Many thanks to Bonfire VN for pointing that out. This eye imagery reminded me of Nietzsche's famous aphorism that when you gaze into the abyss gazes into you. So when we stare at the primeval current, it's staring right back. While there wasn't much new lore added with the Deep of Night update, we did get this intriguing tweet from the Bandai Namco account. A crimson malice stirs within the lightless abyss, its raw rage weeping into your foes. And as I mentioned before, in Elden Ring, the primeval current is deeply linked with the abyss, as we learned from the spell Comet Azure. So the fact that the Deep of Night emerges from a lightless abyss could be another piece of evidence that the outer god of night is another name for the primeval current. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to know what Jens think.